Hi, I'm Cadieux, an animator and illustrator.
And I'm Ira Marks. I write and draw comics, and this is a podcast about the mysterious and magical process of bringing cartoon stories to life.
In today's episode, we're going into the Inkwell and talking about Fleischer Studios' series, Out of the Inkwell. Welcome to Cartoon Feeling.
Caitlin, the past is complicated.
Yes. Yeah, indeed.
And sometimes we have questions about it.
Frequently.
Yeah.
I would say.
I mean, there's a lot of topics out there we have questions about.
Like why?
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. But the big one is cartoons.
Question mark?
Yeah.
Yes.
And if only, we've been striving to find that perfect guest to kind of explain the past to us.
Yeah, all the other ones we've had, not good enough.
I mean, they're
Sorry,
great.
Past guests.
Yeah, but guests of the past, listen closely. You're all great and we love you.
Great job.
Do you have the scope and perspective we need? Are we building up this guest too much? Do you think he's
I don't know. How are you feeling?
I'm being built up.
Neutral response.
I like it.
He's liking it.
I like
We're
it.
getting
he's
a
ready.
more gesture.
Right.
All right. I think we have to introduce him now. Caitlin, despite everything.
Despite all your rage.
We've got a perfect guest for our topic today. If only somehow that just all came together. And we're going to welcome out from the Inkwell, as you said earlier.
Yes.
Reid Mitenbuler. Hey, Reid.
Hi.
What's up?
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I'm kind of nervous. You know why?
No.
Reid, do you know why?
Don't be nervous.
It's okay. We're going to get through this.
Okay, so Reid wrote a book called Wild Minds that I thought was really great. And I've been telling people about it. I told you about it a long time ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah. I'm going to tell Reid about it today. I don't know if he's reread it since its publication, but I think he should go back and check it out because it's a story about the artists and rivalries that inspired the golden age of animation, which is written on the cover. That's not my own words. But
it sounded great.
Reid, is all this true so far? I got to bring you in.
100%. It's a book about classic animation, the first 50 years when it was kind of very different than what people, I think, today think of animation as being. It was a little more adult and kind of body, and it was kind of what created a lot of the original templates that we still use today. And it was a really special time. So I wanted to capture that, but also look at it through the studios that I think kind of define that moment or are the most interesting from that moment, and these rivalries they had and how that kind of pushed along their art and created competition between them that was just really interesting to watch play out. There's a great business story there, but also a really good creative artistic story. So that's what I was trying to capture, but also do it for a general audience.
Yeah.
Pitching the book. I was like, there are a lot of books that go really deep into little pockets of animation history, written by people who know their stuff, but these are a little bit more, they typically tend to be, reference books and things like that. And I was like, this is a world that's fading. I think a lot of people today, they know, who Betty Boop is or who Felix the Cat is. Like they know them as icons, but they've never actually seen a cartoon with them. And so, that world, it's disappearing a little bit, I think, for a lot of people. And it's becoming part of the past. I kind of wanted to revive that and show how it's still relevant today in a lot of ways. The struggles that these artists face, they're still going on.
Yeah.
And then unearth it as being a very different period of history than a lot of people think of it as today.
Oh yeah.
So that was the goal for general audiences. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it because Caitlin and I, we both love collecting cartoon books.
True.
Yeah. But I think we find that, and this is no shade on them, they're mostly from the artist's point of view of the work. Like we love to see high-res scans of like sketches for, I don't know, Bambi. And it's
Tyrus Wong.
Yeah, it's all such a specific story, especially with Disney. And it's such propaganda for the narrative they want to share, you know? But like your book just weaves a tale that feels very true if you're in the narrative art business. And I feel like when we do this show, I'm thinking about the types of stories you tell in this book, because that's kind of the charm of the business that evokes like the imagination. It's the situations these people were in that creates the stuff that they make, which is a weird phrase, but it's kind of true. And I guess this is the highest compliment I could give to something. When I started reading Wild Minds, at first I thought it was just going to be, and I love these things, like a really dry, just historical document of times and places of, you know, Disney and Max Fleischer and Chuck Jones and all these guys. But it really puts you in the place of what it was like to be there in a way. And I thought that was really great. And it made me want to write a graphic novel, like set in the world of this early kind of chaotic era of like that silent film era where everything was just being done in one big warehouse because they weren't recording audio. Like that idea is so...
Yeah, it's really noisy.
Yeah, that's kind of magical because you don't think about that, right? Like you think about the modern studio system where everything's quiet in a box, but it was just like a room full of people doing what they could to like build an art form and a business at the same time.
That is not dry. That's the opposite of dry.
Yeah.
Very little in this. And I will say, I like reading about unvarnished personalities behind a lot of stuff like this. So I'm really used to, I kind of mentioned this already, but just like I'm really used to reading a lot of like books about Walt Disney, and even the like, this is how it really was kind of books about Walt Disney are still like somewhat... I guess it's hard to write about Walt Disney without putting some glamorizing language in there or something.
Yeah.
And just some of these characters, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. But then you just move on and it's like, this is what they did and this is how they acted. But here's like also some really messed up stuff that happened or whatever. And that to me was even more like, it's very hard for me to have an idea of what it actually was like back then. Like, I can sit here and be like, oh yeah, in the 1920s, the world was in black and white, kind of, you know, like we're so far from that time. Like, I don't know. And this actually just made it feel a lot more realistic human stories. Like these are just guys and like they have their certain motivations and their interactions just in that period.
And for me, the goal wasn't to go garbage hunting and find all this stuff where it's like, oh, and here's the seedy underbelly. It was just to find human moments. Mm-hmm. You know, those moments, there's like, there were people, and there were people living in the time they lived in, and they were reacting to the times they lived in. And these are the cultural influence that shaped them. And they were just, and so you find those moments. And I find that you always find them in these little tiny things. Like when I learned that Walt Disney, for instance, you know, would practice his autograph. There's a lot of little kids will start practicing an autograph, you know, forging your identity. Who am I? Who are you? And you do this thing. And he would do that, you know, and you find like little tidbits like that and kind of try to scatter it, you know, throughout the book so that people can relate to that. They can relate to those little tidbits.
Yeah. The book zooms in really closely on some specific moments, but then it like bounces way back out and then it jumps to another figure. It just feels, I don't know how else to describe it, but it's almost like a Pulp Fiction of cartoons. Like everything's kind of intersecting and meeting at different moments. It's a type of, it's a version of the cartoon history story I'd never really seen done like this. So, and all of that is to say, audience, you should read Wild Minds and you should get it from your library and also buy it at the same time. Enjoy it in stereo.
Read both simultaneously.
Okay. Now, we're here today we could talk about so many things with this book, but we're going to kind of zoom in specifically on a specific figure, Max Fleischer. Am I saying his last name right?
I assume so.
Yep.
Now, my first question for you, Reid, is to me, this book is kind of, it's centered around him in a lot of ways. I feel like I get to know him the best, because he comes in really early in the story and he's kind of in the last final moments of your narrative. How did you end up kind of, choosing Max as like a central figure in this, aside from like the obvious things? What about his story really like connected for you?
So my first idea was to actually do a biography of him, and kind of this idea of, I'm always fascinated by people who are like number two in an industry because everybody knows the number ones, you know? And with Max Fleischer, you have a figure who's almost like the Scottie Pippen of animation.
Yeah.
Arguably the best basketball player, the second best basketball player in the league. Unfortunately, he's got to play in the shadow of the best basketball player of all time.
Yeah.
And so, and they're different. And I don't like superlatives or ranking like that, like who's better and who's, and a lot of people will do that when they get to Fleischer and Disney. Like, well, here's this one vision, here's this other vision, and they compete with each other. In a lot of ways, I don't think they competed at all. They actually kind of complemented each other. But so I was learning about him, and it's like, here's a name, Disney, that's a household name, and everyone can name all of the characters that come from that name. With Fleischer, I was like, I don't think many people could name the character, Coco, Popeye, Betty Boop that come out of that studio. He's not a household name. So I was like, why not? And when you look into him, what makes his story so interesting is that he is denied credit a little bit. There's a great story from Wild Minds where he's competing with Disney a lot, and they're poaching each other's talent and that kind of thing. And Disney's going to be the first to make, a widely released feature film, Snow White. And Max Fleischer's are walking in New York when Snow White comes out, and it's premiering at Radio City Music Hall. And Radio City Music Hall was built on the site of Fleischer's boyhood home.
Ouch.
Yikes.
Like they had raised his boyhood home to put in this place that becomes a shrine to his competitor's masterpiece. And he's got to walk under the marquee and kind of just stare at his feet. And then, that loud family, and he's got a sister-in-law who's like, well, he's making art. You're still just like, showing characters who are hitting each other on the butt with sticks. He's just got to take this mile of crap from all these people. And I'm like, that's like a really interesting story because he's great in his own right. He did all of this really great, interesting art. And so, this is how books start. You just get, really curious. And I had known about him for years, but I was sparked because I was reading another book that mentioned him. It was A History of Coolness by this writer, John Leland. There's a history of the American concept of cool. And, he defines, what we've always seen as cool as there's this rebellious aspect to it in America. Like you're always pushing back against, mainstream or, what polite society thinks of as proper. And, you see this in rock and roll, lighting your guitar on fire, but you also see it in a lot of literature. You see it with Mark Twain. He kind of puts Mark Twain as one of the original hipsters, Herman Melville. Like there was always this kind of thing about him. And he uses cartoons as an example, and he uses the Fleischers, he uses Felix in this book. And, Warner Brothers characters. And I remember after reading that thinking, a book about Max Fleischer, this would be really interesting. The problem is biographies don't sell. If they're not about people who audiences already know about, so if you're David McCullough, it's like, the Wright brothers, everyone knows who they are, but they don't really know anything about them. Or Walt Disney, like any name that people, it's like, I know this icon, they want to read a biography. But if it's an obscure person, not a good, then you want to find a story that I think people then get pulled into the story. And so, thinking about it more and talking with a few friends, my agent, I was like, what about a rivalry? Because there's this rivalry. And people like to read about rivalries. And then it became, about the rivalry between Max Fleischer and Walt Disney. And then, my editor, Aquarium, were talking about it. It's like, let's expand it out. Like all these different, because they all were kind of rivals and, and he was like, I don't really know a lot about any of these studios. So let's build that out. So that's kind of how the book came about, which is a great idea of having an idea and then being challenged and collaborating a little bit and having, getting honest feedback where people are like,
Right. And creating the structure that's really going to kind of bring that story to life for an audience that might not know they want it yet.
You want to create the scaffolding for a story that works, and you want to bring tension in, and there's tension from the rivalries, and Max and Walt were huge. And then the Warner Brothers, like all those creators, UPA, there's all these tensions. So you get this engine that just drives your story because, one would come out with a character and the character does really great. It's really popular. Then another one comes out with a character that kind of makes that last character a little bit passé, a little bit more obviously. So it becomes an arms race for cool characters.
Right.
And so they're all like, okay, now we've got our, it's like, Mickey Mouse has a girlfriend, Minnie, so we've got to give, Bimbo a girlfriend. And that becomes like Betty Boop, and it becomes this cycle, and it's really creative and kind of fun and cool. And there's this tension there, like, well, will their studio survive? Will they come up with their next character once this character starts to fade in popularity? So they're always kind of having to reinvent themselves. And that's an exciting story.
Caitlin, let's give our feelings on Max Fleischer, because I think this is
excellent.
This book has kind of like changed my perception of him. And I'd like to start with like the honest truth of where we were at before we sort of like
hated
into his story.
My greatest enemy. No, well, I'm glad you asked, because basically I didn't really have an opinion before. And I don't think I realized it until I read this, and I was like, oh, for all the reasons that you're giving of, why the story was interesting and to tell this story, like, I'm not really aware of him as a person or like about the brothers or any of that stuff. I watched some of those cartoons growing up. Like, I know about Popeye, I know about Betty Boop, but I wasn't really cognizant of the individual as a person with like his own. And I complain about this a lot on the podcast, but I really dislike that I have been so susceptible to like the Disney propaganda that he basically invented everything. And I never was like laboring under the delusion that he literally invented all of the stuff that goes in animation, but they make such a meal out of it that I was like, oh, they came up with the rotoscope? Like, this is new information for me. And it's like weird that I didn't know that. Yeah. So that I got really interested. And when I was going back to rewatch some Popeye stuff and some Betty Boop animations, I sort of had a new appreciation for them. I mean, it's been a long time. And again, it's a lot easier, I think, even for kids now to grow up having seen like some Looney Tunes or some old Disney cartoons. Like, maybe they're a little bit more accessible. At least I haven't gone out of my way to hunt for these. I was just watching like YouTube rips, basically, of these old Betty Boop cartoons and stuff. But they were doing really interesting stuff, like in Popeye, using 3D like miniature backgrounds.
Yeah, it's
sometimes
crazy.
For the sets, and I was like, this looks awesome. Like, this is so cool. Why did I just not care about this?
It's true. Yeah.
And it looks awesome now. And the thing that I'm always struck by is when they were doing it 90 years ago, it's the first time it had ever been done. So, there are movies that when we watch them, I think, people will talk about, George Méliès, or they'll talk about some old filmmaker and how they did something that was very vanguard and new. And, I remember learning about this in film history classes or whatever, but it doesn't really seem new when you see it because you've seen all of this work that came after that was inspired by it. So you've already absorbed the impact of their imagination in a lot of ways. And, it's like people are like, oh, that was so vanguard for its time. But you look at it, today, and it's like, well, everyone does this. Everyone uses this camera technique or whatever. And with, the old animators, especially Fleischer, it's like, that was the first time. And they were just coming up with this stuff. They were creating the rules, which makes it even more impressive when you can. I appreciate it more now that I'm older and think a little more along the terms of let's put a little bit more historical context around it. And to think this was coming out of nowhere, especially the Coco cartoons.
Right.
Like I was, there's one that's Jumping Beans, I think it's called. I'm terrible at old titles. It's kind of a Jack and the Beanstalk sort of thing, which is the old animators that take these classic old, fairy tales, fable-y kind of stories, and they would treat them the same way jazz musicians treat the old standards. Like, here's my riff on it, here's what I'm going to do, and they're competing. So you get Miles Davis playing my favorite things, and Charles Mingus playing his version of my favorite things. The old animators kind of did that with a lot of these classical stories. And Jumping Beans came out in 1922. It's 100 years old.
Yeah,
God.
Coco's climbing up into outer space.
Right.
And it's like in 1922, and it actually looks in a lot of ways sort of like outer space. Like we even have pictures today that are just coming from NASA, and it's this wild vision of outer space. People haven't even been to outer space yet, and they're and you see Earth from like way up in the stratosphere. And to think that they were doing this 100 years ago, it's pretty amazing. And you're like, wait, everyone has done Jack and the Beanstalk, and there's so many versions of it that came after, and that one's still better than a lot of the ones that came after. So it's like you get a newfound respect when you look at it next to the date.
Right. Yeah. There's something about, you can feel the discovery of an idea. Sometimes I feel like with cinematic language, you're like, oh, that locked in something so clear that it becomes the reference point for everything after. And there's something, when I think about my early experience with Betty Boop and Coco the Clown. First of all, Coco the Clown seemed creepy because I had been reading Stephen King's It way too young. So I'm like, clowns are just a vessel for like a space demon.
Well, there's a lot of anti-clown propaganda like in our generation.
Right. So things have kind of, tarnished the reputation. But I think it comes down to presentation, because before you start to look into context and read a history book about, the what and where and when of things and industries, it's just, what's the VHS box look like? And I remember having the old Fleischer Superman cartoons, and I knew in my mind, as a kid who liked to draw, that the animation was really well done and very smooth and clean. But the box looked like crap next to my Little Mermaid, like clamshell. And I'm like, inferior, just based on that, right? And I think that's a lot of people's impression. It's like Disney was so good at serving you up their ideas on like a silver platter for so long.
Well, it's the branding thing. Like, I love that you brought up that Disney would practice his signature, because honestly, I hate that about him. Like, it's such a great fact, but I'm like, you dude, come on. Like, but he, that's why, like, the brand was so valuable. So, I mean, who am I to, it just pissed off a lot of the people working under him, because they were like, can we have some credit? And he was like, no, right. No, I guess not. But and I wonder, is it a branding thing? Like, in my mind, from reading these stories, like, Fleischer is the scrappier one. There's a really good quote, and I can't remember who says it. And I want to say it's Max Fleischer, but I could be wrong, where he talks about Walt Disney, like Disney Studios making, what is it, like chicken salad, and we'll make chicken shit. But like, that was beautiful.
Paul Terry had the quote.
Mm.
And I think, wasn't he was in upstate New York.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it was like artists were coming in and wanting to do things, because Paul Terry, and everyone kind of makes fun of Paul Terry because he made money, though. That's the thing. He made money, but just didn't make that great cartoons. And he was like, no, they make. I think it was him. I have to go back and recheck the book. I remember that quote.
They have a great personality. But I recall that because I was like, and Disney's always on the verge of going broke because he was just so chaotic with all of the way that he ran his business, and like very strange spending habits, I feel. And like, it makes sense. Like, they're just different philosophies. Is unfortunately, for better or for worse, one of them leads to longer lasting cultural impressions, because if you throw your name up there and you blow people's minds like enough times, like, they're going to remember you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I hope came through in the book too, that I really wanted to make this point about Disney, is that Disney of the 1930s and 40s, very different person than what he's imagined as today. Because in the 50s, he's presenting a more corporate appearance, and he's got the theme parks, and that's what he's focusing on more. And that Disney, the Disney of the 30s and 40s, even though the 50s, has nothing really to do with Disney today. It's just this corporation with his name on it. And I asked myself while writing, what would he think of his company today? And he'd probably be impressed in a lot of ways. He would probably, he would look at the size and the scope and the money it brings in and just the sheer ambition, and it would be impressed. But as an artist, and he was very much an artist, he might be a little disappointed. He might even be a little bit bored. There's a great quote that Disney has where people were pushing him when he was going to do his first feature to do The Three Little Pigs, take that short and turn it into a feature. But he was very skeptical of sequels and franchises. And he said, you can't top pigs with pigs. But so what would he think today of all the sequels and the franchise?
Right.
So, because everything's a farm animal metaphor back then.
Yeah. And I think that the Disney in the 1950s, you've got the counterculture that's starting to bubble up. And as part of a cultural revolution, if you will, you kind of take what came before and you want to do away with it, throw it by the wayside. You want to kill the old idols and create your new idols. And when you're looking back at the past, there's no bigger figure really in the culture than Disney probably was. He was one of the very, very biggest. And so a lot of commentators turned him into something that he never was. And that's when you start to see these rumors of him being a racist and anti-Semitic, and like a lot of that is it's like internet rumor kind of stuff.
Right.
Not really. And a lot of historians have debunked it, but they were trying to create him into a thing that would be easier to reject. There was a straw man effect to it. And I think Disney's reputation with creatives sometimes suffers for that reason. They think of him as, he was just that thing. But the real Disney, the 30s and 40s, he was a pretty interesting artist. And I was really struck, and I wanted to make sure this all got in the book. You had artists like Salvador Dali or Thomas Hart Benton or Orson Welles hanging around trying to get at him so that they could work with them. Everyone wanted to work with this genius. And so, I wanted that to come through. Like, I don't like poo-pooing, Walt Disney in the way that sometimes happens today, but at the same time wanted to show that Max Fleischer was a guy who did these things very differently. The Fleischer brothers did things very differently than Walt, did present this different vision. Sometimes they get set up to sort of oppose each other, like, Disney, from the Midwest and then moves to California, West Coast, Fleischer, East Coast, immigrant experience. These are like opposing Americas. Not really. They actually all kind of come together in a weird kind of harmony of America just being a big, weird, mixed up, kind of jumbled up melting pot place. But there was that tension, between them. And you do see something very differently being done in each of their studios at the same time that they kind of work well together too. For the time, they both were doing interesting work, just in different ways.
I think we need to, let's zoom in on Max's early, Max, can I call you Max?
My bestie Max.
Max Fleischer's early life, because I think I don't know, this is how I always feel, sort of like your early experiences with, what your father did or your mother did for a living, whether you have siblings, all these things like become a bit of how you perceive the work you do or your ambitions. And I feel like the Max Fleischer story is so much more intimate than Disney, because his blows up so big, like you're saying, Salvador Dali, all these people coming in. But Max Fleischer, it's such a like East Coast, a guy and his brothers, they're all innovators, right? So just like and Reid, you can hop in here wherever, but I tried to pull from your book some of the like quick, simple facts about Max when he was a kid. So like you said, immigrant family, his dad was a tailor, kind of struggling businessman. They lived in Brooklyn. No.
Yeah, well,
kind of Williamsburg-ish. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so there was, and this is what's so interesting too about the dynamic with the brothers. Is so Max was born overseas, but some of the brothers were born in the U.S. There's a big age difference between them, and the father, a tailor, also kind of an inventor though, and did very well when they were living in Manhattan. And then the business wasn't doing so well, so they moved to Brownsville in Brooklyn. And so you kind of have these two upbringings. So you've got Max, who grew up a little more comfortable in the beginning, Manhattan, and then they move, and that's where Dave grew up, is out in Brooklyn, and then the Coney Island thing. So these brothers, in a lot of ways, had very different experiences growing up, and so some of the tension between them, it's easy to see how that would spring up. Max was a little bit more formal, and he was a dapper dresser. Dave was known as being a little bit more, disheveled and that kind of stuff. So,
kind of a huckster, yeah. I feel like they call it.
So the brothers all had like, in this instance, they're all brothers. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the brothers, like they're brothers, and they have that thing that binds them all together and being brothers, but they also had very different, this big age span over all of them. And they had some different upbringings between all of them. So they were very different in a lot of ways too. Thrown together, they'd fight and, squabble.
Right. I feel like that's a big part of their story, but there's kind of a magic of like Lou, was into music. Dave is like kind of the performer. Max is like the visual artist. Like you start to put, and then is it Charles? There's another brother that developed kind of this version of the skill crane arm. That's like, they all have this like little place. And, you could say this about Disney early on too. They were just as fascinated with innovation and technology. The stuff behind the camera is the stuff that goes in front of the camera. So you've got this kind of innovative family doing their thing. You've got Max studying art, right? He's like an inventor. He goes to art school. And then you have him, he's
got an engineering mind too. He's working for popular science, and he was really into mechanics. He was really like engineering, fascinated him. He really had two brains.
This is a little tangent that I find the most interesting part of your book because I feel like my brain is kind of like this too, in that I'm drawn to how something works or like how something all comes together as much as like what the story you can tell with that. And we're going to get there a little bit when he adapts like the Einstein theory of relativity, which is like that like really captured my imagination, I'll say.
And the Scopes monkey trial. He was really interested in these scientific questions. And those were kind of failures as movies, but he wanted to scratch that itch and go. And well, failures like commercially,
right.
You know, but they caused, you know, especially the Scopes monkey trial thing, it caused a big stir.
I pulled a
theory of evolution.
Yeah, I'm saving those for the third act of this conversation because I have some questions about all of that and how it like works its way into the book because I don't know, I think for some people it's like a really unique aspect of this story you're telling. Okay, so Max he's drawing comics, which makes a lot of sense. And then this is a little story I'm pulling from early on in your book. Because I think this is kind of like an inciting incident of a lot of what's going to come next out of the Inkwell story. Okay, so around 1914, animation generally looks like crap, right? Everything's kind of stiff and rigid. It looks kind of like crappy flip book-ish stuff. There's no sense of like physics or squash and stretch. All that stuff has yet to come. And I think this is in your book, or I read this somewhere else, but Max is seen or is being talked to. He's the art editor at Popular Science, and his boss, the editor, is like complaining about J.R. Bray's Colonel He's a Liar cartoons.
It basically ruined. His boss was Waldemar Kempfer. I opened one of the chapters in Wild Minds this way, and it basically ruined his boss's date night. Right? It's like he's like, I took Mrs. How pronounce his name, Clampaford. I never found out. They go to the theater, and a cartoon pops up on the screen, and his wife just groans. She's like, "Oh, I hate these things," you know, which a lot of people did. They were cartoons that only been around for a few years, and they were kind of starting to get a little gimmicky. You know, people were retreading ideas, and it's like, eh. So he calls in Max Fleischer, and he's like, you know, you've got a mind for this kind of stuff. You know, maybe because a lot of those guys were all coming out of the cartooning arcs, like Winsor McKay and cartoonists. And it poses a challenge to him. Like, these are so bad, it seems like there's a way to make them better. And then from that, you get the rotoscope. You know, he starts trying to put these mechanical, technical solutions to this problem. You know, to smooth out the motion, the jerky motion, and improve the craft a little bit.
I never really thought a lot about rotoscoping until you and I keep bumping into it like every other episode.
It's happened a lot, yeah.
So, just have you seen a schematic of the original rotoscope?
I have. On Wikipedia.org.
You want to describe it to the people?
I have seen large, chunky, lots of blocks that probably have gears and stuff in them. I don't know. And there's a camera type looking device on one end. Essentially, how it functions, I'm given to believe, is that you project your footage that you've already shot of a man dancing in a clown outfit or something similar onto a plane so that you can trace on top of that to create the drawings that will then be the animation.
Brilliant.
Now the process is much easier via the computer.
Right.
But honestly, yes, I did not know that rotoscoping was invented back then, and like finding that out makes sense. I think I just never questioned it, and I think about it a lot more in modern terms, especially because I work in animation, so I think more about what is being made now with rotoscope technology. But like, what a smart move if somebody comes to you with that problem. And like, things are just jerky and not looking so nice or realistic, whatever. I want to make this more pleasing to the eye. And you're like, I'm going to invent an extremely technically elegant solution to that problem. Here you go.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of incredible.
Yeah. And a very technical, and it kind of got past a lot of the issues that his boss was complaining about. What I like about the rotoscope story too, though, is that it creates this kind of cartoon that you see in Coco, where it's basically a human form traced And it had its place in animation. They used a little bit of it and say Snow White, when you need a human being and you need to kind of bring in that sort of realism. But animation's advantage as an art form also, though, is that it isn't really dealing with reality. You can take people out of reality and create some fantasy world that looks nothing like, it looks like whatever's going on in your head. And then a lot of animators later on, especially when you see the squash and stretch technique, it was like, well, we can do these wild, crazy things that human bodies can't do. And so animation needs to lean into that. And so then you get this opposition to the rotoscope. And a lot of the animators who hated it, were like, I don't want to use it. Let's stay away. So it then became a tool that you could use when you needed to inject that quality into animation, but you weren't necessarily relying on it. So it evolved as well. And I think that's a really interesting part of the rotoscope, that Max comes up with it. And you see that in those early Coco cartoons, out of the Inkwell stuff, is they all start, there's a template to them. A lot of them start, and it's a mix of live action and animation. So you've got Max sitting at his desk and he draws something, and then, the clown, and then the clown comes to life, and then it takes on a life of its own. And then, a lot of times by the end of it, Max is in trouble. Like the clown, I think it's in the Jumping Beans, use that one again. The clown clones itself, and there's an army of them, and then it becomes like the Gulliver's Travel story, and they tie Max down, and you see that kind of story in a lot of them. And the underlying message to me was, I've created this technology, we create this thing, we have to be careful, because where will it go? Max, it always ends up with him tied down on the ground.
Whoa, cautionary tale.
Yeah, it's very
Dr. Frankenstein.
It's a total Frankenstein. No, yeah, it's exactly that. It's
yeah. And it makes sense though, because there's so much tech involved, right? You have the collision of, live action film, and then you have this sort of backstory of Winsor McKay's sideshow of him being the self-proclaimed original animator. You've got his Gertie the dinosaur, and a lot of that is him he's integrated into that performance. It's a stage show that he's doing for so long. And then it sort of transitions into something you can see on the screen. And now we have a rotoscope. It's just, it kind of, it's as internet tech collides and new things kind of explode, new art forms explode out of these innovations. It feels like a similar era, because these cartoons feel so clever at all points, right? Out of the Inkwell, they're clever.
Yeah, the gags are so great, right? You'll see his hat, and his hat takes on different forms, and it's the same thing with the Emile Cole stuff. The very, 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 very early beginning, alongside at the same time as Winsor McKay. Coming out of this tradition in France with the incoherence, and it was all very abstract, and it was, let's imagine these dreams, the phantasmagory, and then bring them out on the screen and kind of recreate what that looks like. It starts with Max, that realism, and then, and they get out of it. And then fast forward and you get to Walt Disney and Fantasia, where you're just dealing with abstract shapes, and, it's not at all like anything you'll see on Earth.
Right. And it's following art movements as well, right? We have surrealism and abstraction and all these things. Now, so just for a little context before we get too far ahead here, that first rotoscope experiment that they do, it's based on a Charlie Chaplin dance. And I think this is important because this is something Caitlin and I talk about. And I believe you say this in your book. You explain how long it took them to rotoscope trace this whole shot. So they took 8 months to create a 3-minute, rotoscope version of what's probably Charlie Chaplin's Kid Auto Races at Venice, because that's the 1914 film that came out then. It's I'm not sure if that's true, but it was a very early Charlie Chaplin before he's even really known famously as the Tramp. And they take it around, and Max is look what I got. And people are what am I going to do with that? How long did it take you? 8 months? What do you?
Yeah, they're get it. Can you do one a week?
Yeah.
Something. I don't even know if it was the same one, but some rotoscope thing they spent a long time on. He was no.
That's the one. It's such a good lesson to learn, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're realistically, this has no value to us.
it's like we can't show the same thing over and over in front of all these features that we're playing.
Right.
So can we do can we get a fresh one every week? And they were also worried probably about, I think,
copyright. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Although Chaplin was a very gracious artist, and was totally cool. There are other business interests involved that weren't so cool about it, but Chaplin was apparently always very kind of nurturing to these guys. There's Chuck Jones has a great story about growing up and then going and watching Chaplin make movies and, seeing how many times he does it. And Chaplin would come over and talk to the kids, and he was like a pretty cool guy. So he probably wouldn't have cared, but business interests care.
Right. Totally. So then Max goes to Dave. Dave puts on his clown costume, which he'd been wearing on Coney Island. I don't know if he's running some kind of sting operation. Like, what's he doing? Is he?
I gathered that he was doing practical jokes on people. I don't know. I was like, what is a clown back then? I guess
he was like an entertainer on the boardwalk, and he would just go around terrorizing people, basically.
Doesn't sound like a bad job, really.
Right, yeah, it's kind of like it.
Great job.
That's kind of fun.
Yeah. Good work.
An entertainer at heart.
Good gig if you get it.
So
everybody wants to be the Coney Island clown.
So as a side gig to his Coney Island gig, Max brings his brother on and it's like, oh, well, we'll film you doing your bit, your clown bit, and then we'll rotoscope that. And now we'll have like our own character. And the cool thing out of the Inkwell, if you're attuned to this, if you're kind of an illustrative mind, you can watch that character kind of become a little more cartoonish as time goes on, and sort of it become more of a cartoon character than just kind of a rotoscoped figure, it's that thing you were saying about how the art form needs to kind of, this needs to be a tool, not the end result, right? The rotoscope. Yeah. It's like you have to kind of bring your imagination into it to make it fully effective.
Otherwise,
I love watching.
Otherwise, you're just filming a clown.
Just tracing.
Yeah.
Just filming a clown like some kind of freak.
Yeah, it's just live action at that point. It's like.
Well, and I loved that. I don't know if this is what you were getting at exactly, but I didn't realize that, like, there's this guy that worked at the studio at some point when they were making these Dick Humor, who was like, let me tweak this design a little bit, like make it a little bit more. And I was like, wait, that's a Disney guy. And I looked it up and later he was. So it was just another fun fact where it's like, this industry is microscopic. Like all of you are the same.
Fleischer guys, they're like all Disney guys too. Because Disney would poach them. And there was a period where Max had to poach some of them back, but a lot of them left. And I loved
that they would skulk outside. Was it like Roy Disney would just wait outside for them to go to lunch for like the Fleischer studio and be like, hey, do you want to come work for Disney? We'll pay you double whatever you're paying.
The way a pirate hires a crew. It's like, well, I'll give you a little extra silver than that guy's
just hiding in the alleyway. Like, want to make some money? Come to the West Coast.
All these, it's such an interesting take on what an artist is. Like these animators, they're described as such assets to like this kind of bigger system because early in this day, everybody's kind of working where they can put a desk, right? Like these guys are all squeezed into rooms. I think Max Fleischer they're all working out of like I don't know where their early office is. Where they first set up before they become like more of an official.
Their apartment, really.
Right.
They were working in their apartments and just kind of, figuring it out there. And then they had a studio, and then there was a studio underneath the groaning floorboards of a brothel. And then they later moved to the 1600, I believe, if I remember the address correctly, 1600 East Broadway, which I found old pictures of it too. It later became a big car dealership was in there. It was big. That was like it was like a factory.
It's such a different story than and you can see it in what the ink out of the Inkwell shorts are about. There's such a New York, East Coast, like industrial, brick-laden city, like jazz music, brothel, like all that stuff is there in the out of the Inkwell stuff in the way like Disney cartoons don't feature any of that influence. And you can really feel like, oh, you're kind of making stuff rooted in where you are, even though when you see it as a kid, you're like, oh, it's just all fantasy world. But the out of the Inkwell really feel like just some dude sweating it out in New York, struggling with this clown who just won't stay put.
Whereas where Disney was first working, it's actually about less than a mile from where I'm sitting right now in my house. There's a Gelson's on Hyperion, right before if you know LA. it's now a Gelson's. It's this old Spanish stuff. That's where they made Snow White, and it's like weird that they would tear that down because it wasn't a bad. I mean, when you drive through the neighborhood, totally. You still see like these buildings that look like Snow White because a lot of builders and contractors at that time, it was such a big movie. They were like, oh, we'll make people's houses in LA look like a Disney
I want
movie.
the Snow White house.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, that influence. And then, the Burbank studio, which was, very well thought out. And it's like almost like gardeny, and they've got stuff for people to do. It's like the modern corporate kind of tech company campus sort of thing. They've got... Mm-hmm. They're taking care of the blondes. Whereas you imagine the Fleischer animators during their lunch break going to play like stickball in an alley that smells like urine.
Yeah, there's broken glass like stuck in their shoes.
Glass. It's like people are trying to rob them. People shooting at rats. The corners. It's totally different. Whereas Disney's got a nice cafeteria and people are playing volleyball so that they could stay in shape. Walt builds them volleyball courts. Yeah,
I think that is a good illustration of the difference in their sensibilities and like how we perceive them, though, because totally like Walt always struck me as the like idyllic. I'm making a utopia for everybody.
The best case scenario.
Yeah. Like he had that utopic mindset, and then it's like we're from Brooklyn, or like whatever. Like we're like really doing it.
Yeah,
like, and that just totally different.
It's like those two different mindsets, and they both have their place. Where Disney was was creating an escape. And during the pandemic, that's something that like my wife and I, we really started leaning into when we were watching, because you're just at home all the time. I want movies that I can escape into that aren't negative and aren't depressing. It doesn't have to mean that they're maudlin or, Pollyanna-ish, but you remember like an escape, like we can kind of go to this fantasy world and enjoy it. And there can be a little bit of optimism. And then there's filmmakers who want to push reality into your face a little bit. And there's a value to that too. And so with the Fleischers, you get a little bit more of that, where it's gritty, it's a little bit more urban. And we're going to talk, they had more themes about, assimilating and the immigrant experience and that stuff. What was so great about them, it wasn't pushy. Like it was never sanctimonious. They weren't giving you a lesson. It wasn't propaganda. It was just like their experiences, and they were kind of having fun with it, just throwing it up on a screen. And so that message gets there, but you're seeing more and more now, and maybe it's an effect of social media, but I'm seeing, talking to producers about this lately, it's like we're seeing more and more TV shows and movies where it's like, oh yeah, they're trying to cram a lesson on whatever issue down my throat. So the Fleischers were channeling those cool experiences in a way that, you could reflect on it and kind of learn something, to put it that way.
Right. And I think the experience is so new to the audience. Just the fact that it exists is, it can be enough, right? So like basically, I feel like so many of the Out of the Inkwell shorts, they're really like a little improv game. It's like, well, and this. And then because of that, like this, they're just riffing on the riff. And then by the time you arrive at the end, you're just in a totally different place from where you began. And that's enough, right, to sustain an audience.
It's very cause and effect. Like you can imagine these people sitting in a room and one of them comes up with an idea. You know how it is when you're working on your own stuff. If you're in a vacuum, you can come up with some good ideas, but it takes you a little bit longer. This is how it works for me anyway. But if you've got the right kind of friend, if you've got a room, like a writer's room, you come up with an idea, and then somebody takes it in a different direction you weren't thinking about, and then that gives you another idea, and then you create this back and forth. And if you can capture all that, and that's how you think of those gags in those old cartoons. It's just like a bunch of people sitting around. What if we did this? What if we did that? Well, what if, and then you just end up at this place way different than where you were set out for, if you were really setting out to go anywhere in particular. But you see it really with Coco, because it's just like, jumping beans yet again. It's like I'm climbing up a beanstalk in outer space. Now I'm in some sort of heaven. Now I'm cloning myself.
But I love that. So what I like about that one too, the jumping bean one in particular, that I noticed, like even in the writing, it starts to get like, I want to say overly clever, but it's not overly clever. It's like really good clever, where like the giant shows up And, you know, he has his, like, silent movie text card, and it's, like, the fee-fi-fo-fum thing that, like, the giant would say. And he's like, I smell the blood, blah, blah, blah. But he says ink in this one instead.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, God dang it. Like, it's funny that you went all in. Like, you're a cartoon man, and I'm a cartoon giant. You don't have blood. I smell your ink.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then to clone himself, he carves a stamp of himself, and is, like, stamping copies of himself onto the paper, and then they, like, pop up into, like, actual real version. And I'm just like, you're all playing in the space, and that's really funny. Like, all the jokes and stuff you're making actually have some foundation in the world you're making. It's not just a total free-for-all. Like, you're all really fully in it. That's really cool.
That's great. Yeah, there's a logic to it. That same kind of logic poked itself into, you know, the later stuff, Betty Boop and Popeye. But in those early years, it really was that mix of real and then of live action and animation, where you've got reality in this fake world, but there's a permeable membrane, and they're going back and forth. You know, Max Fleischer and Coco he's got this creator thing going on. I'm creating you, but then, you know, the Frankenstein thing, like Caitlin was saying before, Coco's always sort of becoming quite a little character.
And I feel like Max Fleischer was poised to do this because from like his interest as a cartoonist. So when he was working, let's see, I think it's when he's working at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, he's doing, I might be wrong in this, but I know he's doing a comic strip called E.K. Sploosher, the Camera Fiend.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's for the Daily Eagle or not, but it's like almost right off the bat, he's like participating in art, but also being a little meta in that it's like, through the lens, I'm going to tell you the story of a guy with access to the lens that tells a story. In the way I remember looking at Winsor McKay comic strips early on and being like, I'm reading a comic because in the last panel, a baby will sneeze and the panel breaks. And suddenly you're aware that there are panels. Like Max Fleischer is like constantly making you aware cartoons take work to be made, and here's how it's done. But also, this is funny.
And Max Fleischer probably would have been a big fan of Charlie Kaufman, you know, adaptation,
or being
all
John
Malkovich. It's like very meta, and that's something that I really like about, especially those earlier, is that it was meta, but not too cutesy or gimmicky. Like Caitlin was saying, the stamp. You know, he creates a stamp to clone himself. Because I'm going to clone myself. I'm not doing it in a biological way. I'm doing it because I just create a big stamp that I can stamp myself out of ink. You know, like one of those library stamps. I remember it's like, you know, you can just imagine it being smashed down on a book. You know, like due date. But except it's Coco.
Yeah, I get the impression from this work that like Max Fleischer was somebody who was really smart and had enough time to do something fun with that. Whereas, like, you might be like, I'm smart and I'm bored. Like, what do I do? And he just applied it into these things. Like, how else are you like, I'm going to come up with a rotoscope and then I'm going to do all, and it's also different. Like, this feels almost passe to bring up just because we've talked about it so much, but just the fact that so much of it is like heavily integrated with live action. He wasn't the only person who was doing that. Like, Disney had his Alice in Wonderland shorts that he worked on for a while that had live action components. But and so I don't know who came up with it first. Yeah.
Winsor McKay.
But just like the amount of integration that they're doing in these is kind of startling. Again, just to realize like, oh, this was made like in the 20s. Like there was no established, you know, work through for this.
Right.
And there's one, I have them just playing on a loop right now, but this one's they have one where it's just like, there's a bunch of kittens like running around in like a little theater, like just live action kid. I'm like, what are you thinking? Like, where'd you get this idea? But they thought it would be fun. And he's like running around the town, putting up posters with his dog that they were like, we're also going to incorporate like a theater full of cats. And just, I don't know. It's a creative spirit that I really enjoy. I feel like you get really unique, interesting stuff out of that when somebody's like, I can do this and I will. I'm going to.
So I've got a question for you too. Do you ever feel when you go back and watch some of these old cartoons, it doesn't have to be just the Fleischer stuff, but anything from that era, I have had moments in just the past few years where it feels like some of these cartoons are more relevant now or feel more fresh now than they felt in the 90s or the early aughts. Like there's something about this moment that's giving them renewed relevancy. And I think in a lot of ways, like, because especially when they start getting body, or when people are like, oh, you couldn't do that today, there's something about it that it's like they're transgressive in a way that feels refreshed, and you're
Right.
seeing them pushing, and so it's like some of them feel fresher now than they did 25 years ago. And of course, they felt really fresh when they first came out. But I'm starting to notice that with myself watching. I'm like, ooh, this feels.
Oh yeah.
I've a writer friend. We're talking about literature, and he was like, it's like not a lot of like literature is kind of in a low place right now. It just doesn't feel like there's like a lot of really good. People aren't paying as much attention to story as they should. And he was talking about how he's got a book club, and they're going back looking at books that came out 20, 25 years ago that might have been slept on or forgotten about. And he goes, that's what we're seeking out now. Or I've got a lot of friends who are like, I've been watching a lot of older movies for certain kinds of stories that you don't see, more adult stories.
Yeah.
And I find that with these old cartoons, there's something that they're getting a new power again, because we've just had a moment where a lot has changed technologically with streamers, and there's been this blender effect.
Yeah, AI art in particular is something that's like really weighing on my mind lately. I don't think we've talked about it. And I don't even have that much to say about it, except I don't really like it and it freaks me out. Like sometimes it looks cool, but I'm like, this seems bad. I don't care for it. And I don't like how people are using it necessarily. And there's like, I don't know, something almost cathartic about watching stuff like this where, and I do want to emphasize that I don't think like, oh, it was a better time, because I think for many reasons it wasn't in many ways. I don't know. Every time is just the time it is. I'm not necessarily nostalgic for this era, but it was nice that there was a sensibility of people like hanging out in a room together, like just trying their hardest, or people being like, I really believe in this and I want it. So I'm going to like show up to people's houses and be like, what do you think of this thing that I worked on for the last 8 months? Like, that feels really good to me. And it just feels like, oh, like there's this human drive to do that we still have. And we've had it for a long time. Like, it's almost like reassuring to see this. Like, these people could have lived now. Like, people like us that exist now could have like been doing stuff back then, creative stuff. I don't know. It's just reassuring to me as a creative person that's just part of the human spirit. Like, people want to do that.
I like that point, Caitlin. There's this, I'm glad you brought it up. The book Gilead, by Marilyn Robinson, there's this idea in it where they're like, I don't think she says this directly, but it's like history, which we so often see as the source of our discontents, and is in a lot of ways, also contains the remedies. So like when we have a past moment in history, and we can see all the flaws in it easily enough. I have another book coming out in February, actually, that deals a lot with this stuff. It's about a polar explorer, and those can be controversial figures. But we look back at these past eras and you can see all the flaws really easily, but it's easy to forget good things that were lost. Like, as we made a lot of progresses that we've made, the pace of life, or the way that we were forced when we were watching movies, for instance, to be in a room together, and there's a communal, almost church-like thing. Like, there's really something to that. And then the way that experience focused our attention. And I was watching movies in theaters, my attention is focused in a way it isn't necessarily at home, watching cartoons in that way. And so when I see some of this old animation, you're reminded of, a way that people were, that they were a little more relaxed about certain things. And maybe there are things that they shouldn't have been relaxed about, but, like, that is what it is, like, whatever. And there is a nostalgia. You have to be careful with nostalgia. I always walk a line between, there's smug sanctimony, where we look at the past and we're like, it was just awful, and everyone back then was just, terrible. And then the nostalgic effect of, the rose-colored glasses of, let's return this former era, which really wasn't that great, but we only remember these great aspects of it. And in these old cartoons, you get a lot of that mix where you realize there's ideas of community, how we experience the art, the kind of humor, the kind of risks they took then that maybe they couldn't take now. You see those things, so they're valuable to have and to watch. And so you kind of a la carte take what you want from them. And there's still like a lot of good that they offer, I think.
Yeah. I think part of it is the space that these were created in can feel a little magical in the way it's more personal, that you're kind of, you're hanging out, you're all in a room together, which is like part of why we like to do the show. We can like be in a room and do a thing. Like how often do you get to do that with anything anymore? And also there's the, this is pre-Hays Code, which I think is a big thing to point out, because that really changes the types of representation that are seen in the cinema for people. So I think there's the loose Wild Westness of it all, where it's like, until you push Betty Boop too far, no one knows to be like, that's too far for a cartoon. But what's a cartoon? Well, a cartoon's this now because you went too far. Like there's something so freeing about this art form. Cause one of the other cool things about this book is like kind of the lesson is cartooning was an art, like, because, last week we did an episode about Masters of the Universe, and for all the great artists that were inspired by it and all the fun you can have with it, it's in a way culturally a low point for animation because it's so perceived as like a tool for selling a product. Yeah. Whereas none of this stuff is really selling you anything other than we're trying to learn how to bring a drawing to life. Isn't that a magical thing to try to do? It's like trying to go to the moon. It's like everybody was paying attention in this moment. And I think that's something Cuphead tries to capture, when things throw back to an old cartoon. There's something really magical about it.
And that's a great point, because to move it off the Fleischers for just a quick second, they were just figuring out merchandising. Like the Felix, there were lots of Felix adults, and Disney was figuring out, the reason they didn't have it wasn't because of purity or nobility. It was just, they hadn't quite figured it out yet,
Fair.
But,
sure.
So but Looney Tunes is interesting. And if you go online, you can see there's this really cool interview with Joe Dante, the director. I did Gremlins and done a bunch of stuff. And in the late 80s, right after Gremlins, and I believe even like Steven Spielberg might have been tangentially related to this. I might be wrong on that. But Joe Dante wanted to make a movie about the old Looney Tunes, call it Termite Terrace. And he had a script. Even it was apparently like a really good script. It was live action, and it would have a little bit of that Who Framed Roger Rabbit kind of aspect to it, like going back to the old days of animation. This is how it really was. And it eventually died at Warner Brothers. And, one of the lessons he draws from this experience was, don't work with IP that you don't have the rights to, ever. Thinking that you can get the rights, get those rights first. But he also, he wanted to kind of capture that old spirit from this older era. And Warner Brothers was like, no, because right about that time, you've got Space Jam coming out. And I just had this vision of executives at Warner Brothers looking at the older history and saying, we know what it used to be. We know that it used to be cool and in a very different way. But now we use these characters to sell fluorescent colored sporting apparel to children. And that is what we do. And that's what we are going to continue doing. And we don't want to pollute or infect our current stable of these characters with the older idea of them. And you get that kind of changes over time.
Right. The success of this art form in a way kind of cursed it, right? Because the fun rooms of animators become long halls that basically look like kind of a Ford car production line. It's like guys at desks work until they're dead, which is often a thing we come back to on the show. It's the art of cartooning, to aspire to do it great is to destroy yourself in the process. Yeah. In a way.
It's hard not to, I think.
Yeah. And luckily people bring, I feel like motion graphics in particular is constantly developing tools to try to avoid that. It's here's a thing you can use to achieve a rubber hose effect or whatever. It's you don't have to die to make something look cool.
And even then, we're still dying. We're still out here dying.
There's always new ways to die. So a little bit of irony here as we kind of talk about Max Fleischer, because as being painted as the underdog in the shadow of Disney, or having his home demolished so they can screen Snow White. Max, the cartoon that he was hired to do better than, right? That Colonel He's a Liar by J.R. Bray. When Max finally sells his rotoscoped idea and gets himself like a job that's going to lead him to Out of the Inkwell, it's working for J.R. Bray, which is funny.
Right.
Right? Is that true? Yeah. Okay.
Well, J.R. Bray ran into him. He was pitching. He was going to go pitch the guy. He was basically going to try to cold pitch Adolf Zukor, head of Paramount. Before it was Players Lasky. And this guy was tough as nails. Like no one, screwed around with this guy. And he was, trying to get off the ground with animation. And then Bray had started doing work for Zukor and runs into him in the lobby and, will come work with me. And so, he did. And Bray later, his career kind of, I don't want to say piddled out, but he really saw where the money to make just a stable living was. And it was doing training films, kind of commercial work, that sort of thing. And so after the war, Max and Bray and all these guys had done training films for the Army and did stuff with the military during wartime. And then Max and his brothers, they leave because they wanted to do more creative stuff. And they've got this character going. And Bray was Bray was successful doing that stuff for decades later. But yeah, it was interesting, the way that they kind of partnered and used each other. Not really a rivalry there, but helped give them that leg up, employed them for a while they got their own studio off the ground.
So this era of, kind of instructional videos, you list a couple of the titles in this book. So Caitlin, I could imagine that you and I back in the day, when you're working for the Atlantic, you're doing more like journalistic animation, or I'm doing like science cartoons for the European Research Council. Back in the day, we would have been working on such films as how to operate a Stokes mortar, how to fire the Lewis machine gun, submarine
No, I think I did that for the
lane.
Atlantic. How to fire machine gun.
Did you really?
No.
Oh, shit. You had me. This one would actually be good, and I would be happy to be part of this project. How to read a contour map.
Yeah.
And how do you?
Well, that's a great question. And Max Fleischer had to explain it. I think, audience, all jokes aside, I think part of this crafted this sort of like this aspect of him that wants to make something clear in a way, which cartooning is so much, whether you're entertaining or not. It's all about like clarity of a design that like gives an idea across. And I always wonder if, having projects like this early in your career kind of set the tone for how you indulge or approach your own creative ideas. You know what I mean? Like there's something in Coco that's so good that might come from his experiences before that. Because like when he gets, okay, I'm going to bring this up now. When he gets to wanting the pursuit of explaining Einstein's theory of relativity, which he does, it's like in 1923, right? It's kind of, it's after the war when people are kind of like trying to settle back into, pursuing scientific research, helping the layman understand these ideas. Max Fleischer's like, I'll explain the theory of relativity to people. I think there's something about those war films in him that's like, I can connect with people and share these grand ideas. I don't know. What do you think, Reid? I feel like that comes across in your book a little bit to me.
Yes. Well, but also because he, working for popular science and that journalism background, and you get the explainer aspect of that, like, and bringing it to life for people, with the military training videos, you're teaching soldiers how their weapons work, knowing how the bullets are, the rounds are coming out of the casings and that kind of thing, in case your weapon gets wet or sand gets in it, because like they could take you inside of the weapon, or how an infection spreads if you're a medic, and then drawing a diagram and blowing up, germs, spreading like an infection. So people get the idea, especially if they're coming from backgrounds, they don't have a lot of education, just helping them visualize it. It's like, oh, that's how that works. So, and you could use animation to take a concept and illustrate it basically, and so, oh, okay, I can see it. And you add in motion and all of a sudden things start clicking for people and connecting so that they can, keep their wounds clean or whatever.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I feel like I have a personal take on that.
Yeah.
Personal take.
I don't want to step on you though.
No, please.
Well, because as you say, this is like very similar, but less wartime themed is the work that I did when I worked at the Atlantic. So a lot of it is explainers. Yeah. And then some of it was like a little more flavorful, but still editorial in nature, kind of regardless of the topic. And I did really enjoy working on that. But I think similar to what happened with Max, where it's like, as soon as that ultimatum sort of came through, I don't know that Bray phrased it that way, but he was like, this is what I want to do. Like, this is where the money is to work on this stuff. Like, this is the stable route. He's like, oh, no, I actually want to do like the weird, cool stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's crystallizing in that way. Cause like, I don't see myself working in journalism again. And I did really enjoy my time in it. And the type of work that I got to do. And like working on Vox's Netflix show is like really fun. Like, and then you feel good about it in a way because you know, like teachers are showing this in their classrooms and stuff. And like, you can hear stories about that and be like, oh, like I did something and like people are actually deriving value from it, you know, or whatever. And like, that is nice. But you find out what you're into. And I think a lot, like either that's just the only thing you want to do, in which case you're going to just stick with that and you'll be fine. Or you're like, but I really want to like bust out and do some weirder stuff. That stuff is very constrained. I don't know how it was in this day and age. I imagine there were a lot of like, you're like literally working for the government.
Right, yeah.
Like there are rules. Like you're not that, you're like, I'm going to do this in like a fun, colorful way. It's like, no, you're probably not going to be able to do that. And there's going to be like budgetary constraints and all this stuff. Like, personally speaking, I mean, yeah, like I did it and now I want to do the fun, weird stuff.
Right. Take those skills.
Yeah, there's the Fleischers of the world but then there's also the Disneys where it just reminds me again, we did an episode about, Mars and Beyond, like Disneyland show, where Disney basically like, oh, it's the 60s and like, let's just like, we'll do this. We'll talk to people about space. And it has all of the Disney magic elements to it. And they do get really fun with it, but it's also very educational.
Yeah. NASA propaganda.
Yeah. They're basically like, let's hear from a scientist about space. But then they keep doing, but they're like, but what if the aliens looked like this? So it's like a mix of both.
Off the rails. Yeah.
So there is that thing where it's like, it almost feels like maybe Max Fleischer was a little bit ahead of his time just trying to do stuff like that, where he's like, I have a technological mind and an engineering sensibility, and I'd love to use my interest in animation to share that. But just like things weren't quite there yet. And like by the time we got into maybe like the 50s and the 60s, Disney has perfected the art of making that kind of program. So then there's like Donald Duck and Math Magic Land or whatever, where it's like kids are learning about math, but it's like pretty fun.
Yeah, he was just like a naturally curious person too. So he was letting the curiosity sort of, take, well, it's, I'm an animator and I'm curious about this. So why don't I go?
He's barking up the right tree for sure.
Also coming out of the war, an interesting thing too is like, okay, so you want to be making animation and then you've got Felix the cat, which is just burning it up. Right. And it's famous. And you're like, wait a minute, I could do it. Like, we just create a character and like riches are generated and all this stuff. It's like, it's pretty simple. It's like, wait, we have the setup for this. We know how to do it. Not that many people do. Felix the cat, like, I want that, it's kind of, which gets back to the rivalries part of this book and all these, the Felix the cat episodes. Like they've got this huge character and everyone is like, oh, okay. So, I feel like animation up until sound, there were these moments that happened pretty regularly where it almost went away, where people were like, this is just a gimmicky, no one really cares.
Yeah.
Like the novelty effect is kind of worn off. And then there's always some new thing. It's like, oh, we could use it for instructional videos. That opens up possibilities. And then the Brays of the world go off to kind of do that aspect of it. And then you've got, oh, wait, we've got a character, Felix, that's huge. So we can do this thing. And, oh, okay. And that kind of gives it new life. And then you get up to sound. And again, you're at a moment where everyone, like a lot of the studios are like, is it really worth it? Customers aren't really that into it. We've kind of worn out everything we can do. And then sound comes in and it injects new life in it because, okay, we've got the possibilities of sound, but it also injects life in it for the commercial reason of all these studios owned music catalogs, and recording. And they were like, oh, ancillary income. Now we can make these things and then we can just require people, like, you got to put 2 of our songs in it. And we can promote our song. It's what people today call synergy. And it's like, it's like, oh, and that breathes new life into the thing. So it's like animation was constantly getting, these adrenaline shots. Like, it's like a scene in Pulp Fiction where, you got the big needle and you stab it into Eric Stoltz's heart or whatever. Constantly bringing it back to life. And it's interesting because Max was there for all of those turns. It's like, okay, I'm here for this one, I'm here for that one, I'm here for this one, and then the music thing, and so he's there at all those moments and wrote him and kind of saw in the future too. Like the first sound cartoon, Max Fleischer. Speaking of things, I think Caitlin brought up earlier, you think that Disney gets credit for all these things that he didn't actually do. And he set standards and there was certainly greatness there, but Max Fleischer actually,
he did some stuff that he should get credit for sure. He did not do stuff,
he
but
was a genius in his own way, but it was like, but he is getting, that genius was so big that he ends up becoming like a black hole that sucks all the credit from all these other people who actually did things first, or, did it before he did, or he took, I don't think he was trying to do that. It just kind of naturally happened because he was such a big figure and such a force. But a lot of it actually, you're like, oh, it was actually these Fleischer guys. They were actually doing that or did that like 4 or 5 years earlier or whatever.
It's also, it's such a, to look at it as an art form. I can't think of like another art form that, what you're able to do, what resources you get to have to create your work is so tied to that type of content, whether it be a song or a character. It's like, you want to make a beautiful cartoon, it's got to have Felix in it or Mickey Mouse. Like these central elements, like before that art, I'm sure there's cases of it, but with cartooning, it's so built into it right from the beginning. As soon as these guys realized that if they had that perfect character, they could kind of explore whatever they wanted to, because Coco goes all over the place. He travels through space and time. Like, he's like living the theory of relativity. Felix pulls whatever he wants out of his suitcase or his carpet bag because he has the resources to like have a team of animators create that ladder that goes up like 30 stories, right? It's just so interesting that with that character, you can do what you want. And that character becomes such a precious thing to the creators, right? Like they identify with it. Like Walt Disney is Mickey fundamentally, when he explains it, but also like business wise, it just has to be because his like fortune is tied to it. And then, Coco is that for a while.
Yeah.
Do we still have that today? I know that's kind of a random question, but like when was the most recent Mickey Mouse-esque figure born? Like, is that still a thing?
I don't know. Reid,
is there somebody in a studio right now, like,
who's the last
making
famous
Felix?
character?
Like, are we beyond that point? Like, is it achievable?
We might be.
I mean, there's
kind of freaks me
tons
out.
of new characters coming out that people grow attachments to. Not on that scale,
I think just
though.
like the scale is not necessarily attainable anymore because of saturation.
I was talking about this recently with a couple screenwriter friends, and we were talking about movie stars, and
right,
there was recently just
that
recently,
Ethan Hawke show.
No,
sorry,
the New York Times Magazine had Jonathan Majors on the cover, and it was like, oh, he's gonna be a star, he's gonna be a star, and I'm like, well, he's already a star. But stardom, like it's on the cover of the magazine, but it's like people keep saying like, oh, he'll be a star. And I'm like, actually, stardom has changed. We don't have stars anymore like Robert Redford or, Clint Eastwood or Denzel Washington, those
or Coco the Clown.
Yeah, like those people all became stars in an environment where there were fewer places where people would go to be entertained, right? Like you go to the theater and movies would go longer. You could have, you had less distractions. I saw a statistic a couple years ago when the Oscars came out, and they were like, historically, movies that are nominated for Best Picture have something like in the 90 something percentile for Americans who recognize that movie exists at this moment in time. And they were looking at the Oscars just 2 years ago. It was the year that Judas and the Black Messiah came out. that was the film that had the highest name recognition. It was only like
Never heard of it.
Oh.
I will be honest.
Well, it was in
Whoosh.
It was in the 30. It was like 30-something%, and it had tons of big actors in it and everything. And I was like, we're just in a place now where everyone can go down their rabbit hole and do their niche-y thing, and it's cool in a way because it's like, oh, this thing that I'm really specifically into, I'm not forced to see something I don't really care about, but it's the only thing. Stardom has just kind of changed. So for back then, Mickey, you didn't have TV back then, but then when you did have TV, you only had a few big stations. When you look at the viewership numbers on something like I Love Lucy, and it's like 30 million people or whatever, and this is at a time, if you had 30 million people watching your show today, those are monster numbers, and today we've got 5 times more Americans. Whereas back then, I Love Lucy, those are like the numbers it was pulling in an era when I Love Lucy would play, cities would report crime drops, restaurants would sometimes close on the night that
is amazing.
The television show, The $64,000 Question, which comes up in my next book, so I know these statistics, which beat I Love Lucy in the rankings. It was like Eisenhower was like, don't bother me. I'm the president. Don't bother me while I watch this show. It's like you would see like this ripple effect in the society. I'm like, we don't have characters or media, with the exception of like the Super Bowl, maybe still, which is like a lot of people tune in. That just creates that tsunami effect that you used to be able to have back then, just because the barrier to entry to being heard in media was just higher. But if you could clear it, the payoff was also higher. Whereas today, the barriers are lower. I mean, you can have a blog or you can do something on a fairly small scale. And it's cool to give like a smaller audience this thing that they're really passionate about. But it doesn't have that just like, effect.
Yeah.
That you used to be able to have, for better and for worse. I don't like to bemoan that kind of stuff, but
just different.
And these characters are a good example, like Felix the Cat. I mean, when I was doing the research for the book, that character, and it had recognition worldwide that was massive. Obviously, Mickey Mouse, but in its time, Betty Boop, Popeye, it was huge. Everyone knew what it was. Where today you're confronted by so-called stars. Oh, they're a star. They're a star on TikTok or they're a star on Instagram. But it's like, not really. I mean, but they have millions of followers, but yet still anyone on the street doesn't know who they are. Like, no one cares. And people are still trying to figure that out too, how it works and how to monetize it. Same thing as back in this day, trying to figure out how to monetize the merchandising.
Right. There's something about, cartooning that translates with some effort to, the real world product, right? It's like you can turn, I feel like Coco, that's what's interesting about Coco is he's kind of right before, he's not an example of that iconography that Felix or Mickey Mouse is, in the way Mickey's ears are kind of exist on a 2-dimensional plane. One reason is because it's simple to animate, like when he turns his head, the ears stay where they are. But it becomes an iconic silhouette for a logo, and it becomes a great design for a simple toy that can be manufactured really quickly. Whereas Coco is a man in a costume, and it has all the baggage that comes with that in terms of like, clothing that has to move independently of like the body that's below. It implies so much more than just the simple form of like a black silhouette of a cat like Felix.
And I wondered too if they anthropomorphizing
right.
the word plays into it, where as far as becoming a celebrity or star, it's just a man in a clown costume who's covered up and you don't really see him and he's obscured. Whereas Mickey or Felix or any of these other characters, well, they're an animal. There's something kind of cutesy about it. They get a mascot thing. Although I'm saying this and I'm thinking while I'm saying it, but then you have Betty Boop, who's a huge icon and she's a human.
Right. But she, did you point this out in the book? I came across that she started out as like a dog.
She was a dog, yeah.
No, I love that story. And that's a great Disney,
so bizarre.
That's a great Disney Fleischer story, right? And to illustrate the difference between the two studios. So you have Grim Natwick. And back then you've got all these really great cartoon artists working for both.
Where are you going?
I'm riding a motorcycle as I talk.
Your audio's great,
cool.
actually.
Very cool.
It's really cool.
You've got all these great artists that during the Depression, like animation was a great gig for them. I mean, they probably would have been unemployed otherwise. So it was really good. And you've got Grim Natwick and, helps create Betty Boop. And she's obviously very, voluptuous and Zaftig kind of would be a good word for it. And, very sexual. And then he, like many animators, goes to work for Disney. And there's that story where they're creating Snow White. And Disney was very concerned with how we present Snow White. It's like, well, she's got to be old enough so that it's cool when the prince comes to take her away, but not so old that she's too sexy when she's like younger.
We've talked about the age.
It's like they really
perfect line.
Yeah, they really stressed on it. They really focused on it. So they're getting all these, designs. Some of the designs, it's like, you just imagine Walt sitting there like, nope. Next,
she's too hot.
She's too hot. She's not hot enough. It's just going back and forth. It's like, and then finally, I think with Ham Lusky, she was a little too cutesy, a little too sweet. He's like, no, and then he has Grim Natwick now in a studio who worked on Betty Boop. So it's like, okay, you guys work together and come up with something. We need a little more of that Betty Boop, but not too much. And those two working together just didn't get along. But what ended up kind of emerging from that kind of hit that perfect balance that Walt was looking for that would really play in the movie. And that was his genius, was that kind of perfectionism, that kind of attention to detail, and finding people who are better at him at very specific things like drawing or, whatever, but being able to put them together and then challenge their talents in order to come up even to a different level than maybe they would have on their own.
Right.
So yeah, you get that. And I think that's a great story about those two kind of working in harmony, Walt Disney and Max Fleischer at the same time in history, and how the influences were kind of cross-pollinating each other, maybe in ways. This very cool story from Fleischer, Grim Natwick, a character involved in this story, then goes to Disney and brings some of that influence over. So they were sharing some DNA. I thought that was a cool thing to explore in the book.
Yeah, I think it's with the Disney has that pursuit of appeal is always the word that appears in every Disney book, like whatever that means. It's hard to describe, but you can see it, and it's very clear in the journey of, the evolution of the films from the shorts. Max Fleischer, well, I do want to talk about the technical skill of his team in these early shorts, because it's like unbelievable when you go back and watch some of them, the way characters turn around. It's stuff you don't see anybody really aspiring to do in like streaming television. I was watching a short, which one was it? I don't remember the name. Like you said, Reid, it's like the names just sort of like flow right
There's
through
a lot of them.
I remember album titles for artists, but I almost never remember song titles. But I'm like, well, it's like the fifth song on this album. I still think of music in those ways. And with some of these look, it's hard. You're like, well, it's the one that does this, so and so, and yeah.
I was watching the one with the spider, where the thread the spider's web becomes like this thing that iterates throughout the short. But early on, a lot of these early shorts, they feel very staged in that the characters are almost existing on this very theatrical plane where they don't really come and go along the Z axis. But in these Fleischer ones, there's a lot of movement where they go upstage, they spin, they move in sequence with each other, and you get a lot of frames of, I don't know if you call it like a turn cycle instead of a walk cycle. But so many cartoons don't bother with the turning, the fluidity of a turning around of a character these days. Like there's so many great cartoons out there that exist now. Not a lot of them are in pursuit of some of the stuff, these early Fleischer ones, in terms of just creating a three-dimensional space. It's really amazing. But it is kind of cold in a way, because like when you watch the Betty Boop Snow White, it doesn't hold a candle to like the Walt Disney telling, which is so emotional. Mm-hmm. It's just such a different track that he goes on as soon as the art form needs to reach kind of another level. Max he just like doesn't go the way Disney does, which is maybe what people need out of cartooning at that moment in time.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because it's like Max is the Fleischer version of Snow White. It's much more detached and cold.
Yeah.
And it's inventive and it's creative and there's great imagery and there's really cool music, the Cab Calloway stuff. But it's very, but with Disney's, it's a movie, it's a story, and you've got that investment. And, with the Fleischers, you sometimes wonder, because Dave Fleischer, doing a lot of the direction, maybe wasn't being forced and pushed in certain ways. I just had an experience in my next book that's coming out. It's called Wanderlust. And I had a couple different editors, and I never really worked that way before. Before I said one, central editor, but a couple different ones were weighing in. And I noticed like one editor had a skill set that was a little more like about structural things and scaffolding, and let's put this here and let's get this in, and a little more technical and mechanical, but and a lot of lessons you could tell were hard won on his part, just because he was an experienced editor. And the other editor was really good at emotional beats and characters and emotions. And it's a nonfiction book, so if you have research that would kind of warm the character, bring the character a little more, bring them out in a little better relief. She was really good at that stuff. And I really was thinking about that in terms of, I started thinking back to cartoons and just directing and like creators and creating in general. And it's like having that collaborator that possesses a skill that is maybe a little bit off your radar and bringing it in and pushing you. And the Fleischers might not have always had that. Whereas with Disney, they were a little more concerned with the emotional beats in story than the Fleischers were. And it does feel like the Fleischers, it was a little bit more of a frat house. It was a little bit more bro-y. They both were pretty bro-y, but it was a little more, whereas Disney, was a little bit more thoughtful about that kind of stuff.
Like, I'm going to take it back to that chicken shit quote. Whomsoever may have spoken it, because I think it's like everybody was aware that Disney really wanted to elevate this to a fine art. And so he was like, it was like he always wanted the animation to be more realistic, and like draftsmanship was this huge thing. So he's like fostering these connections with the art school, like, and all of this stuff. And now it's really obvious to me the inspiration with the Fleischers is more in that like Winsor McCay vaudeville type thing. Like, especially the Coco animations, because it's very like, made me think of it when you were talking about how they do all these weird things in animation that other studios weren't doing, and like turning around and like doing just like very interesting dynamic movements. And to me, that really reminds me of how these animators would do stuff at vaudeville shows, where it was always like, here's a new thing for the audience. Like, you can't as much get away with, we're going to use the same run cycle like 7 different times because like we're trying to tell a story and we need somebody to run, and that's economical. It was like the whole point is that you're having this active engagement with whoever's watching. It was very audience driven. That's not to say, like, obviously the Disney stuff was also audience driven. It just wasn't exactly in the same way. When you get to Snow White, he's like, I'm trying to make film. Like, this is cinema.
Yeah.
And Max Fleischer, it felt like a lot of like, I'm interested in the technology and like, I'm having fun and we're doing cool stuff and I want to keep making this. And because I also feel like you see it in the art style, because like the drawings are really good. Sometimes they're like weird designs and more detailed stuff than you would see in like Coco himself is just, he is literally a human, but he's also just like much more human proportionally. I mean, for obvious like rotoscope reasons, but just in general.
And like Mr. Bug Goes to Town, the 3D-ness of the buildings. And there's a picture in the book, in the photo insert, Dave Fleischer with the 3D models that they had set up for that. It looks really cool. Yeah, so at Fleischer's, you do get that technical wizardry aspect, but you're not getting stories from them that hit you the way that, Bambi or Snow White hits you.
So I was like, I sort of just wonder if that's like, this is not what they were interested in doing, because they just, like, they just seem so passionate and, like, I'm pushing for what I want to do. I feel like all of the animation guys are kind of like that spiritually at this time. And probably always. I don't know, that's like a creative thing. And that just Disney was always hammering away at that. And they just weren't.
So they did. I'm not sure the length of these. So, the Coco out of the Inkwell shorts, what are there? There's about 30 of them, I think, or something in that first run before it's kind of revitalized later. Is that right? It's a pretty short amount, brief amount of shorts, but that's what helps them build the company, because then the company becomes like out of the Inkwell Productions. And then that's where you get Betty Boop, and then they go to Popeye. Am I getting that timeline right?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. Yeah. That's the progression. Yeah.
So I wanted to get to the point where, Disney's doing Snow White in 37. Gulliver's Travels is 2 years later. Is that a feature length, their version of Gulliver's Travels, or is it also a short? Because I feel like that's them trying to keep up.
Yeah, I thought that was the intention.
Was feature length. And so Max Fleischer he loved the book by Jonathan Swift, and would read it to his son, Richard Fleischer, before bed. It was one of his favorite books. So that's an interesting insight into the minds of Max Fleischer versus Walt Disney too. Walt Disney was always looking back to these old fairy tales, or what are close to fairy tales in the case of Pinocchio. And it was this book from the late 19th century. And he's looking to that kind of stuff for his source material and, heavily adapting it. And Max Fleischer was always really into this book that's kind of by this, it's a satire. And it's very political, with all these political, very different than anything Disney would touch. And Max had always wanted to make a feature. I mean, this is kind of the holy grail for a lot of these animators. So Disney, who had wanted to make Snow White for years before it ever came out, it was this long-term goal. So he's going down the road to make that. Max Fleischer had made the Popeye cartoon that was like the two-reeler, Alibaba, which is kind of like starting to get there. And there were a lot of, as we were just talking about, technological innovations in that. But there were a lot of people who questioned doing animated features. Like, is it so much work to do? Could we really pull it off? These things are shorts before films. You just treat them that way. Could you really pull this thing off? Well, Max wanted to, but was never allowed to. Disney then pulls it off, and then everyone realizes, oh, this is viable. Hey. This could be a thing. Mm-hmm. And then it was within pretty short order, Max got greenlit to do Gulliver's. And then,
I think it was like a month after Snow White came out.
Yeah, it was yeah, it's in the book. I forget the exact date. Yeah, okay, let's let this guy go do this. And it's funny because, when we're talking of that era in animation history too, one thing that always has to be brought up, because Gulliver's, wasn't a big hit, but then also some of Walt's movies, like Fantasia, weren't hit because of the war in Europe. And that was a huge market. We don't always appreciate it today because markets have changed. Like China's a huge market, which you wouldn't have even thought back then. It wasn't as big of a market. Germany was enormous. And the UK and France, Europe was really big. And so having that wartime market cut off as the war, before the United States was really involved in the war, was a really big deal. Like you always kind of wonder, well, what if there had been a war? How would all of those films have been? We're talking way earlier about Disney always kind of dancing on the line of financial ruin,
right?
Not because the movies didn't work, just because all kinds of paying audiences were, in the middle of a war. So there was that.
Yeah, and you can see a cheapening of like Disney work after, kind of after, even right around Bambi. I think they're making Bambi, and then they're like, well, maybe we could go back to the two shorts and package them together as a thing. It's a little less ambitious. And then during this time, Fleischer is kind of moving on. So he's actually kind of breaking up with his brother at this point, right? Because I feel like Snow White is hitting so hard, it's kind of setting the tone for what a feature, that's the bar, right? This is what a animated feature needs to be. And they're kind of chasing that in their own way. And I think Max and Dave kind of split up because of this pursuit and not really seeing eye to eye on where they're going with it.
Yeah, and that's something that in the book too, I tried to be really clear about the murkiness of it. And whenever you're dealing with that kind of stuff, you're like, I always try to lean into the murkiness. Like, there's actually a lot we don't know. And you've got the financial problems with the studio. The brothers aren't getting along. They've moved to Miami. They moved the whole studio to Miami, and we were talking before about where you make the art really matters. It influences the art, but they moved there because of labor troubles. And Max, they were trying to unionize, and he was running into the same problems that Disney had run into. So he tried to solve that problem by just taking everything to Miami. And Miami was like, well, we'll give you tax breaks, because they were trying to kind of steal some of the thunder that California had for the movie industry. Like, why don't you film here? We got sun, we got nice weather. It was kind of a backwater. Miami was much, much different than today. It's much more built up. Back then it was, it's still pretty backwatery. And so the brothers are having all the squabbles that they've historically had, but they've got the pressures of trying to turn out this movie in a different location. And a lot of their talent left after a while because they didn't like Miami. It was just a hard place to be. A lot of problems like that. And it was like a lot of things were kind of brought to the surface to really hurt their relationship, which didn't really recur. It was a schism that basically lasted forever. I don't know if they were really that close ever again. And then Dave moved out to Hollywood and worked out here, worked for Columbia, did all kinds of interesting stuff. But yeah, not like he had done before. And you see this big falling out, and this studio creator. The studio was still around, but it wasn't run by them. Mm-hmm. The name was changed, and
right, they turned it to like Famous Studios,
yeah,
or something. Right. So
symbolically, their name was even stripped off of the thing.
Yeah. It's sad. It's like the magic of like working with a sibling is something special and like, a cool thing, but also it's like the thing that maybe kind of ruined it because there wasn't one visionary kind of in the Walt Disney way.
Dave Fleischer joked that he was going to write a book, and it was the exact title. It was like, "There's no greater hate than brotherly love."
God,
that was it was one of his interviews, his transcript of an interview. It was, part of my research. And I remember that it was so sad to me. I thought that was so sad that they're brothers, and the shared thing that they did, kind of a shared love, also became this wedge between them.
So, to try to put close the curtain on this whole story. So Max, obviously there's a lot more we could get into, and Wild Minds gets into all of it. So read it. But Max passes away 72, Dave a couple of years later. But the legacy carries on because Max's son, Richard, goes on to direct 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 1954, Fantastic Voyage in 66, and even Soylent Green in 73.
What?
Yeah, I didn't see that one.
Oh, okay.
Tora. He had a really great, he had a really great Hollywood career.
Oh, good for him.
So the way that this idea, this kind of iconography, like the power, like you were saying, Reid, of these early cartoons, like this first iteration of this idea captured on film, we see it pop up culturally as we go on, right? So, I think in our email thread, what did you point out? You said Coco pops up in a specific movie. Do you remember what it was?
Oh, I remember I was watching, so there's a show on FX called Baskets with Zach Galifianakis, which is a phenomenal show. I recommend it to everyone. And Zach Galifianakis' character plays a clown, but a very serious clown. But he's from, I believe it's, he's living in, is it Sausalito? He's living in some part of California that's not very glamorous. And he comes home from France. He's studied very serious professional clowning. And it's a very sweet story. The show is, about this guy whose dream is to just be a clown, a professional clown, but at a very, artistic level. And I remember watching it. There are a couple times where in the background, you'll see a television playing and it'll play Coco. And I thought it was a sweet nod to this clown and this tradition and the artistry of Max Fleischer, from somebody else who's also, a comedic, mastermind, Zach Galifianakis. I think he's really funny. And kind of also a nod to the craft, like to know that, to be doing this thing about a clown, but to know that history and to call back to it in a show, it's kind of cool. You don't see a lot of references to Coco.
No.
He's like the one, when you bring him up, people are like, I don't know, they all know Felix, they all know Betty, they all know Popeye, of course Mickey and all that, that's the character that, it was a big deal in the 20s. It did become an icon, even though it was a big deal in its time.
It's that clown hate that we've been cultivating.
I know.
For the decades.
Yeah. The best he gets is, he is standing in a group shot at the end of Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Oh, is he?
Like Betty Boop, I think, actually has a line, like when all the characters come together. When
yes,
they
Betty
knock the
Boop,
wall
I think,
down.
is there.
But
yeah.
if you look a couple behind, near the ostrich from Fantasia,
iconic,
Coco is standing there. But he doesn't look right because he's done in the style of like more Looney Tunes or Disney. So I think that's part of it too. It's like that aesthetic. That kind of Winsor McCay era line art, like the kind of technical precision. It's something you see in comic books, which makes sense because, Max was drawing comics, but it didn't become like the look of what animation would grow to be, So I think that's part of why he disappears a little bit.
That's
because
a good point, yeah.
It's just hard to draw him in that way, and he clashes, I guess, is the way
he's
to put
almost
it.
too detailed.
He's
And
too
not
beautiful.
cartoonish enough, like in a lot of those drawings are. It's like these guys knew how to draw.
He feels illustrated,
right?
It's honestly like it's very impressive.
Yeah,
like the animation that they were doing to that quality.
It's like elegant's a word. Like it's elegantly drawn. Not that, and I don't want to poo-poo some of the works they like Warner Brothers or whatever, because like there was elegance to what they did too, with the subtlety, with eye flicks, and especially how they brought out character. But yeah, just the aesthetics of Coco and those early cartoons. Well, similarly, Winsor McCay and the Little Nemo stuff, when you look at, there's that great Chuck Jones quote about Winsor McCay where he's like, it's as if the first creature out of the water is a fully formed human being, and then the amoeba comes after it. It's just... It's like, you know what I mean? It's like it's really weird moment where it's like the first shot.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's like you always learn to do, you start bad and then you get good. And like with Winsor McCay, it was like, no, he just like the first thing was like, oh, that's like really good. And
he's a real dinosaur.
But he was also like a rare talent, and he was also doing like, spending like 2 years to do like 3 minutes of it.
Right.
In his free time. So, they had to kind of do it at scale. So
yeah, Coco is right in there with Gertie. They're kind of tragic, not lost, but trapped in a history book. You just aren't going to.
But they're for like us deep cut nerds to be like, oh yeah, Gertie the dinosaur. Like
they're for the 2-hour mark of a cartoon podcast.
They're like, if you're listening to this podcast, it's for you.
Yeah. Although back then, like all those early animators knew Gertie. Like it was like Gertie was,
of course,
I love that Winsor McCay was like a god to them.
Like a god. It was like the way that all of those, British invasion rock and rollers, like guys in the Who and Rolling Stones, all knew, the song Stagger Lee, and all those little blues hits. They all knew. I was like, oh yeah, Gertie. Like they all were totally into it. They had all seen it. It had sparked all their careers. So the spirit kind of lived on through them. They created iconic characters, but Gertie's the character that got them all into it.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Coco. Gertie wins.
Yeah, or Coco. Yeah, and Coco.
And Coco was also there.
Yeah.
Well, that's all for now. Reid, thanks for joining us. This was very good.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. And I was told I could plug the next book. Which is
exactly. Yeah, this is the spot to do
Who
it.
told you that?
Tell them.
No, yeah, you can go ahead.
You did. It's called Wanderlust, an eccentric explorer, an epic journey, a lost age. It's a cool story. It's of this polar explorer, Peter Freuchen, who had a crazy life. Just an absolutely epic, like you wouldn't believe it kind of life. So that comes out in February.
Ooh, February 2023 to timestamp it specifically. And again, one more last shout out to Wild Minds, another great story about a whole bunch of wild people doing wild stuff. Maybe not as dangerous as exploring an iceberg.
Some of it gets pretty wild, though. It's not dry. Again, read it.
Now, beyond that, you can check out the Cartoon Feelings episode archive and other facts about Caitlin and I at cartoonfeelings.com. You can tweet at us or join us on Instagram, and both of those are at Feeling Cartoons.
Ira, that's true. And furthermore, if you're enjoying this podcast, consider stopping what you're doing right now and going to applepodcasts.com or whatever it is and rate us or leave us a review. And if you're feeling extra generous, share us with your friends who know and love Gertie and Coco. And if you leave a funny or a cool review, we'll read it on the show. And we've been saying this for a while and nobody's done it.
Someday. This will
yeah, they're just not funny. Make them funnier. I don't know. But, just something to think about. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.